over to Johnston.
Okay, Loretta, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all. And we have arrived at session 2 or week 2 of our program. And is there meaning in suffering is the kind of theme for the first 4 weeks, or at least the search for meaning. And we turn this evening to Job's sufferings, arguing with God without answers. Now, theologians have come up with the big word theodicy. It was not really invented until the 17th century by an Enlightenment philosopher, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And with his massive intellect, he wrote a treatise in which he tried to explain how and why there can be suffering in the world if God is all-powerful and wants the absolute best for people. Now, theodicy, the word itself, is made up of 2 Greek words, theos for God, and dike meaning justice. And together they suggest that theodicy is the attempt to justify or vindicate God, or to justify the ways of God in the suffering world. Now, way back in 300 BCE, Greek philosopher Epicurus lined out the problem which we are still trying to answer. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then God is impotent. Is God able but not willing? Then God is malevolent. Is God both able and willing? Whence then evil? Now, though the word used by Epicurus is evil, we can exchange it for suffering. And what we're really wrestling with is what 2 scholars have described as a theodicy that seeks to reconcile human suffering with the belief in a supreme deity that is seen to be both all good and all powerful. And those 2 authors, one of them Christian, the other Jewish, go on to explain 2 alternatives present themselves. Either A, God is all good, but not powerful enough to mitigate or remove the suffering and disorder. Or B, God is all powerful enough to eradicate suffering and disorder, but not good enough to want to do so. Simply attributing suffering and disorder to evil or the devil offers an easy solution, but it does not escape the basic problem. Either God cannot stop the evil or the devil, or God can, but chooses not to. So Epicurus set us an insoluble problem, and one that we still struggle to answer. He was not the first to be aware of it. Somewhere between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE, Jewish writers put together a very dramatic story. Perhaps it was a drama about a person called Job who experiences unimaginable suffering for no apparent reason, and spent a very long time arguing and complaining in angry, aggressive and blunt ways with God. Job demanded answers and justice as he struggled with intense, innocent suffering, which seemed to have no meaning. The key word in the drama is struggle, existentially recognizable by us, but Job got neither answers nor justice. Now, is that life? There were Jobs before Job and after Job. We need not go into that, but there was a Sumerian Job. There were a number of Mesopotamian Jobs. There were Egyptian Jobs. And not surprisingly, well, they came before the Hebrews wrote the story or the drama of their Job. And it's hard to believe that they did not have these various narratives and stories in front of them. Job, in fact, is not an individual. Job is humanity, struggling with suffering and crisis and pandemic. Now, Job is a classical piece of literature, one recognized as one of the world's classics, even apart from any status given the book as sacred literature. And for diverse reasons, many have turned to the drama and drawn inspiration from it. There, of course, have been many Jobs after Job. One of them is Christian Job. There have been Joban frescoes in Roman catacombs and epitaphs on tombstones and vaults. And persecuted Christians have made connections between Job and Christ, Job's ultimate freedom and Christ's resurrection. Dominating Christian imagination has been the patience of Job. Job's patience, it is believed, in the face of suffering, his submission to God, his putting up with his life experience has become a virtue to be emulated. A person can be described, and we may have used the expression of someone, as having the patience of Job. But this reading of Job has never got beyond the first chapter of the book of Job. It ignores the impatience, the protest, the anger, the rebellion of Job that is at the center of the biblical story. It has, in fact, helped create a very passive, submissive people who would never feel right having a doubt, being angry with God, let alone publicly express their anger and their doubts and their questions. Now, religious establishments may like to have, indeed control people like that, but faith is not submission to God or religious leaders. Faith is protest, it is angry, complaint, rebellion in the face of suffering without reason. If there is one text Christian people know from the book of Job, it is, "I know that my Redeemer lives." The verse and its meaning or its interpretation has been provided for us by Handel in his great oratorio, The Messiah, first performed in Dublin in 1742. And since then, with Handel, we have connected Job's words with Christ's resurrection and joined it, as Handel did, with Paul. For now Christ is risen from the dead, the first fruits of them that sleep. So in this interpretation, the Redeemer is Christ, and there is the hope of life after death through Christ's resurrection. The aria in Handel is followed by the Hallelujah chorus. And such faith is stirring and of comfort to many, but does it do justice to Job, let alone justice for Job? Well, Handel was not, one suspects, familiar with the full Joban storyline, nor with the Hebrew language in which Job was written. The word in English, translated Redeemer, and translated in English with a capital O, which does not exist in the original, is in fact the Hebrew word goel, a word from family law. Samuel Ballantyne, who is the perhaps best Joban scholar in English language around these days, Ballantyne describes this by saying it designates the nearest male relative, a brother, a paternal uncle, a cousin, who acts to preserve and protect the family when his kinsman is unable to do so. The responsibilities of the goel include buying back family property that has fallen into the hands of outsiders, redeeming a relative sold into slavery, marrying a widow to provide an heir for her dead husband, and avenging the blood of a murdered relative. Well, there are numerous biblical references to that, to which can be added those which refer to God as goel, of those who are in distress or slavery or are too helpless or vulnerable to obtain justice for themselves. Job is expressing the hope that a goel, a relative, will in the end turn up to deliver him justice in the face of his unimaginable suffering without reason. This is Job continuing his protest. Now, who this third-party litigator may be is open to question. The scene is a courtroom scene, and Job is in despair because both family and God have failed him. Job stands accused by both humans and God, has been failed by both, but expects someone to turn up and argue for his acquittal. In chapter 9, verse 33, he has already imagined Mosiah, the Hebrew word. In the New Revised Standard Version, it's translated as umpire, someone who will mediate. the differences between himself and other humans and the differences between himself and God. But at that point, he thinks this is impossible. Job's defense lawyer, his defense against God and friends, his goel, cannot be identified with any precision. As Job struggles with unimaginable suffering for no reason, he has no recourse to a belief in a life after death when perhaps justice can be done. Such a belief did not emerge until about the century between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament. Job's Redeemer is, despite Handel, not the risen Christ. It may be that Christian Job has rushed much too quickly, and too many in the Christian tradition have been perhaps in too much of a hurry to get to resurrection and life after death, perhaps even as a way of avoiding the struggle with a theodic crisis and that very deep existential question of suffering which has burst into our lives with COVID-19. Now, I want to stop there. You can perhaps unmute and let's have a conversation, see what we make of that before we move on to look at faith as protest. We will use discussion groups in after the next piece of input. Okay, any reflections? Question Epicurus posed, I think, is a very disturbing kind of question. And we probably wrestled with it ever since, I think. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then God is impotent. Is God able but not willing? Then God is malevolent. Is God both able and willing? Whence then evil or suffering?
Yeah.
How do we
Johnston,
go about
it's
this?
Clive.
Hello, Clive.
Sorry,
yeah.
sorry. It's Clive here. The one thing that I've been sort of reflecting on over the course of the week is the quote from Viktor Frankl, where he says it's the attitude that one takes to unavoidable suffering, and really suffering is really unavoidable. You know, it's part of human, the human condition. Well, it's part of nature. All species on the planet suffer in some way or another, and I don't think it's the fact that God is not able to remove the suffering, or that He doesn't want us to suffer. But I think it's actually part of living. Part of, and Job, obviously, the writing of Job, you're saying it's probably, Job wasn't just one person. It was probably humankind, if you like, that suffers unimaginably, like it's in the book of Job. But I think it's wrong to blame God or to say that God doesn't want us to suffer, because I think that life per se is involves suffering. It's the attitude that we take to that suffering that is the main thing that is perhaps what makes us Christian, what makes us human. So that Job, I think, is everyone. We're all like Job in some way or another. That's what I think, anyway. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Clive. I'm glad you spent a little bit of your week contemplating and reflecting on Viktor Frankl. That's good. I mean, we quoted from Frankl last week, and saw how he came through Holocaust and various concentration camps and death camps, still with an attitude that was neither victim nor survivor, but something else.
I think one of the things about the book of Job is it's a whole dismantling of a faith tradition, of a way of seeing God. And that was part of what Job's struggling with, because what fills that gap? And I think there's nothing like suffering to begin to push our theological understanding and the models that we're operating out of. That's the first thing that struck me. The other thing that I struggle with, I don't accept it, it's one of the explanations that's often given within the Christian tradition, and it's the idea that God allows us to suffer because we have free will, and evil is a result of free will, and God can't intervene, because that's taking away our free will. I can't accept that. For me, I mean, I would be with the notion that if God is a loving God, God would want to be in there supporting and helping and enabling. And I suppose what Jesus has for me represents is someone who struggles alongside people. And for me then, and if Jesus is for us the revelation of who God is, then it has to be something about God not being able to intervene, but being with people. Now that turns our whole theology on its head, and it turns this idea of a God who's all powerful, that has been, as you say, part of the Christian theology. It turns that on its head. But I think that's maybe where we're at the minute, and that's what we're struggling with. And I think that the Jews got there before we did with the Shoah, and perhaps I mean, Job is wrestling with this, which was obviously is he one of the post-exilic writers? Whoever wrote that, I'm assuming it's post-exile, or maybe it's during the exile. So it's reflecting a deep suffering where there's no answers, and there's no God who's going to suddenly pull him out of the suffering, or pull the people out of the suffering. So I think we're in the same place, but I don't know that there's always answers.
Yeah, I think you're right. The book of Job probably does come out of that exile, post-exilic experience of intense suffering and disorientation and dislocation. And in some ways, it might even be written in terms of a drama, written in terms of a character, which is really a community, disorientated, dislocated, shattered, traumatized, and trying to make sense out of suffering. Yeah, you had some helpful insights there, Kathy. You were away on to October the 13th, though.
Can I just ask you if Job represents humanity, does that in fact stretch to looking at the suffering of the earth today, the suffering of any creatures, not just human beings? Because we're very aware of the suffering, that it's total, it's us, and we are not cut off from the earth, the suffering of the earth, because we've caused most of it anyway.
I think that's a very good point, and whilst we don't touch on it, and looking at Job, we could, because we'll see in a few moments that some of the best creation literature and theology is given expression in the book of Job, which opens up the whole reality that we are interconnected, we are part of nature, we are nature, and the suffering of humanity and the suffering of nature cannot be separated. I think you're right.
Johnson, Stephen, I was just wondering, is there another lesson for us? If Job represents humanity and suffering, and we as Christians can see and feel the suffering that's going on around us in this world today, why are we not more like Job? I think there's a question that needs to be understood there. Why aren't we protesting? Why aren't we being the advocates that say there's a better way, a different world? And I think that's a challenge for people of faith, regardless of whether you're a Christian, actually, but certainly for the Christian faith.
Good point, Stephen. And I think we'll see in a moment that in the book of Job, faith is in fact protest.
Yeah.
And it's a very loud protest and a very persistent protest. And without jumping ahead too far, Job didn't get answers. Job didn't get any answer in relation to justice, but it didn't stop him arguing and it didn't stop him protesting.
Yeah.
He simply didn't shut up and he didn't stop.
Johnson, is there another aspect in terms of faith that the picture is Job being blessed, and the question was, is God more important to Job than his family, than the loss of his family, the loss of his possessions, and then the loss of his health? When his wife came to him and said, curse God and die, Job wasn't to know it was a trial of his faith, but that's a point that James picks up, the trial of our faith being much more precious, and at the end, reflects on Job's patience in James. Is there a lesson in that? Can we hold on to God in faith in spite of the suffering we go through? Is that a lesson?
Yeah, sorry, Roy. Go on.
No, that's the point. Is it the trial of our faith that is being tested? We don't see the bigger picture, but obviously we get the glimmer behind the scenes in the very first couple of chapters, where there's that discourse in the heavens, whatever it is, between the Satan and God, in terms of Job being tested, or the trial or the testing of his faith. Is there a lesson in that do we still hold to God in spite of our suffering, or do we curse God in protest?
Well, there is the possibility that Job's spouse was theologically spot on.
Okay.
She might have been totally right. And Job doesn't shy away from that either.
Okay.
But this is where I think in the Jewish tradition there is this something which I think as Christians we've lost.
Okay.
And I think it's part of the Jewish tradition that Muslims have also lost. This ability to argue and to protest and to proclaim, complain and to curse and to dismiss. I mean, we'll see some fairly strong stuff as we move further into the book of Job in a few minutes. Now, I don't know whether Job is being tested or God's being tested, but Job doesn't mince his words.
Yeah, but God, in the story, God brings up the point of presenting Job. Have you seen Job? What do you think about him? So it's nearly like if God hadn't brought up the focus on Job, the Satan wouldn't have brought all the allegations against him. And God said, okay, go ahead and test him then. See
sure,
what he's
but I think we need, I think what's going on, it was a bit like a discussion that developed yesterday morning in another group we're a week ahead of where we are. And it happened to be around the Book of Lamentations and all that suffering that's going on there. And there were some attempts were being made to read the text, and we might be doing the same thing with Job, trying to read the text as a piece of systematic theology.
Okay.
Whenever it is about the depths of human experience.
Yeah.
And I think the point maybe Kathy made earlier, human experience that calls into question the traditional systematic theology that doesn't work or doesn't fit. And I think that's what's going on in the book of Job. We're wrestling with the intensity of innocent suffering.
Yeah.
And it's a drama, it's a story. And it's the questioning and the protest against the suffering that is innocent, that is inexplicable.
Yeah.
That Job looks for justice. And it's not just Job. This is humanity wrestling with the great human question. This is, in historical terms, it may well be those people who are in exile and those who were left in the ruins, both struggling with the total collapse of their world.
Okay.
And what sense do you make of that?
Yeah.
Where is God in all of that when it seems there's nothing but silence and absence and no one there?
And where is God whenever there's over 1 million people dying with COVID around the world?
Indeed, and we're back with the question is there, and people are asking it now, I think. And we're again back to, we might need to come back to Stephen's question. Are there things to protest about?
Okay.
Are there injustices that have been exposed brutally by COVID that need a lot of protest and a lot of action?
Yeah.
And a lot of anger to be channeled into action.
Would you say that was one reason why God allowed, if you can say that God allowed COVID to break loose, if you're holding to a sovereign God who permits things to happen, to highlight the injustices in the world?
I don't know whether anybody wants to respond. There's a difficult idea here when we say God allows.
Yeah.
We're back to asking, well, you know, who is God? What is God? And what do we mean by that?
Yeah, yeah.
Is COVID just the culmination of the mess that we have allowed the world to get into? It was always going to come to this at some stage, and we're here now, you know. And I mean, we're all trying to say, why did God let it happen? We've let it happen. We've let all the injustices go on in the world, and you know, people suffering. We haven't. I mean, I feel so guilty when I think, oh, I always thought black people had, you know, the same sort of existence that we had, that we were getting there. We were, you know, maybe, you know, nearly there. We're far from it, actually, the truth. We've ignored all, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. And institutional racism is only one of the big inequalities that have been exposed now as they haven't been for a long time. We're becoming aware of these things. I think it's interesting that back in June, the top 10 bestsellers of books in the month of June in the UK, 5 out of the 10 were dealing with Black history and racism, race issues. So it's almost as if people are saying, yeah, we need to start wrestling with this. We need to start we need to try and start understanding where this inequality has come from, where this institutional systemic racism has come from. And the flip side of that is, are we unconsciously white supremacists? Are these privileged by the way the world has been shaped?
Shame on us for not worrying. We've been all right, and our lives are okay, and we have no idea how a lot of black people are living their lives and just trying to get by. Yeah.
Quite.
Mm.
Okay, let's somebody else trying to get in there. I was going to move on.
Yeah, I was just going to raise a question, but it's something that you don't need to answer it. You talked about protest against suffering that's inexplicable. And we've talked then about institutional racism and other types of suffering that are explicable. So I'm just wondering, do we need to hold together that sort of, the fact that some suffering is inexplicable, other suffering is explicable, and it's about recognizing the difference rather than putting it all into the one pot?
Yeah, sure. I think you're right. I mean, I think if we take institutional racism, we can get to the roots of that. We need to get to the roots of that. That goes back to slavery. That goes back to colonialism. That goes back to European imperial powers and a world that was constructed in a particular way. That's explicable. Yeah, but whatever, the protest is there. We can't be passive. And Job had a faith, I think, that was not passive in any way. The patience of Job is a total misrepresentation of the narrative and the drama and the book. Can we look at faith as protest? And maybe you need to mute at this stage. And we'll move into rooms for discussion when we get to the end of this little bit of input. Faith either rushes from the terrible, unreasonable suffering of Job to the happy ever after ending, or rushes to Christ's resurrection by a handle, avoiding the deep existential question and the problem of God, if you like. It was a lengthy process in Judaism to decide which writings made up the sacred text. Some centuries, in fact, before the community agreed on Torah, prophets, and writings, or the Hebrew Bible. Now, as part of the wisdom writings, the classic literary drama of Job was included. Robert Burt, who's looking at the Bible more from a literary perspective, but not outside a theological perspective, says that the book of Job is not an anomaly within the narrative arc of the Hebrew Bible. It is rather a culmination and explicit avowal of the human critique of God that has percolated throughout the biblical text, sometimes just below the surface of that text, sometimes on its surface, though always somewhat muted or reticently presented. But Burt says there is no muting, no reticence in Job's escalating indictment of God. Burt's subtitle to his book, God and Humanity in Conflict, suggests a conflict which is two-way, and certainly a conflict which Job, humanity, has with God. Job is a continuous argument with God in which there is no reticence or a Job who will ever shut up. The drama of Job is protest against conventional settlements or traditional settled theology. Job has a very big issue with the book of Deuteronomy and a big issue with the wisdom book of Proverbs. Because behind these books lie cause and effect, or deeds and consequences. Deuteronomy's principle is that the good will thrive and the wicked will suffer. For Job, this does not match reality. His experience of unimaginable suffering for no reason does not match this cause and effect, deeds and consequences philosophy. Compiled just a little bit before the book of Job, probably, the collection of Proverbs was a theodic settlement which was considered the baseline for community wisdom and the good life for Proverbs, the good life. For Proverbs, it has been said, the world works so that deeds have consequences guaranteed by the Creator in the very fabric of creation. Sowing leads to reaping. Righteousness and wisdom lead to life. wickedness and foolishness lead to death. For Proverbs, this is how life works, and in the settled worldview, community life can be viable and more or less free of conflict. But that same group of biblical scholars go on to say that the only problem is that the rawness and raggedness of lived experience do not uniformly adhere to theodic explanations. There is something slippery and unprogrammed about lived reality. Job's lived experience of suffering does not fit with conventional settlements or traditional established or settled theology. Proverbs represents ancient Israel's theodic settlement, while the book of Job is a theodic protest, challenging the settledness of Proverbs. Social and lived reality are quite different from Proverbs. Now, this is not to say that Proverbs and Deuteronomy are to be dismissed. There is much economic justice and much about economic justice in Deuteronomy, and there is much life wisdom in Proverbs, but they both perhaps unintentionally close down lived experience. Job, as a classic piece of dramatic fiction, poses in a most poignant tone the way in which lived experience disputes against settled religious conviction. The Joban drama shatters all religious and secular moral certitude and highlights how lived reality continually erodes the authority of such absolutism. Job is painted as the paradigm of goodness in the opening chapter. His personal and social morality is unsurpassed. He is the righteous person par excellence. And then life collapses, his entire wealth is lost. The ultimate tragedy is experienced as his 10 children die. This is loss unimaginable and unspeakable. And it is suffering without reason, except his friends steeped in the cause and effect theology of Deuteronomy and the deeds and consequences wisdom of Proverbs. They argue with Job for all of 24 chapters that his suffering is because of moral failure and sin in his life. What is happening to Job, they say, is the judgment or chastisement of God. The universe, they argue, is morally reliable. The obedient life means prosperity, and disobedience brings adversity and suffering. Job cannot argue with moral logic in a morally coherent universe. But Job will have none of it. He protests against his friends and a moralistic God. As Walter Brueggemann put it, there is no way to accommodate settled orthodoxy to the wretchedness of Job's life. The settled orthodoxy is inadequate. It's even fraudulent. Now we stop there. You can unmute, and this time, Loretta, we'll move into our rooms for discussion. And there is a question you might want to take with you, and there may be other more pertinent questions for your group that will come up, but at least keep this in the background. Faith is a continuous protest and argument with God. Is that what we really believe? Faith is a continuous protest and argument with God. Is that what we really believe? We'll take about, I think, 15 minutes.
Great, and the question is written in the chat, which you'll be able to open up in the room if you've forgotten it.
Okay, that's it, I think.
Brilliant.
Yeah, okay. Okay, hopefully you had a good discussion in your room. I don't know how many rooms we had, but if we could take a few minutes, just anybody to share some of the conversation, not a report back, not a feedback, but if there was a crucial kind, an important kind of insight that emerged in that discussion. You had the question, faith is continuous protest and argument with God. Is that what we really believe? You may not have looked at that at all, but something else that you considered more important came up. But let's share some of the thinking before we move into a tea coffee break.
Henry's ready.
Okay. Right. Immediately we went into a group. There was a number of us felt this. We didn't like your question. We didn't like the word continuous protest with God. It provoked a response. Micah, walk humbly with God. But as it revolved around, I think I'm summing up our group by saying, if God is all loving and God is all powerful, then we can see how your question makes sense, that our faith then is our continuous protest with God, that suffering exists, and that is what is to transform us. I think that sums up. So,
Okay. Well, was there any idea from your interesting? You moved through a discussion, and a discussion evolved. Why? I take it there was a bit of discomfort with the question and with the words of the question.
Yeah.
Anybody venture as to why they really felt uncomfortable with that? That faith is a continuous protest and argument with God. Is that because it's not how we've been taught, conditioned?
Yeah.
well, we didn't look at that because I immediately felt it could be because, we are all supposed to walk humbly with God. It made sense to me that people didn't feel comfortable with continuous protest. So no, I don't think we fully explored that.
Yeah, okay, Henry, that's fine, thank you.
Could I just maybe say from our group 2 things? 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
The first point was I felt more comfortable taking without and putting in the word for, but having listened to the rest of the people in the group, I'm happy to say my position would now be with / for God. All right, so that's one thing. The second thing, though, is if we take that quote as it is, how does God use that for his purposes? And if we look at the book of Jonah, I think there's a story there of Jonah in total protest, total denial, didn't want to do what God wanted him to do. And even after he did it, he still protested right to the end. It's unresolved protest is my recollection of the story of Jonah. But yet it achieved God's aim in relation to Nineveh. So to me, that you could see how from the book of Jonah there could be benefit in protest and argument, or God can use that for God's purposes.
But I suppose we need to go back, Stephen, and ask what was the book of Jonah? What was the character of Jonah in that little piece of drama and dramatic story? What was Jonah protesting about?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that Jonah was protesting because God was too generous, and God was too loving, and God was embracing Ninevites, and a bit of humour comes out of the book of Jonah as well. Not only was God embracing the Ninevites, he was embracing their cattle as well. And you can't have that. Not Ninevites. Jonah's theology was exceptionalism. Only he was a chosen, the others weren't, couldn't be.
Sounds a bit familiar, Johnston.
It's a different context.
Yeah.
And it's at a different stage, coming out of a different stage in the history of a people who've come back from exile, and they're trying to rebuild community, and some people want to be exclusive about their community rebuilding. Jonah wants to be and the book of Jonah is a protest against our exclusive and narrow notions of God.
Does that tie in with that notion of walking humbly with God? My understanding of that is it's a protest against ideology and being able to say who God is, and assume that we can know God. So that would tie in with the protest notion of the Book of Jonah as something that challenges any sort of attempt by any one tradition or group to own God. You know, the two sort of go hand in hand. If that makes sense.
I think it's interesting that it is the ethical high watermark of a biblical tradition, the 6th chapter of the book of Micah, to do justice, to love kindness or compassion, and to walk humbly with your God. Maybe we need to go back also and read the 4th chapter, where Micah is as radical as one can be when he has a great big peace rally moving into Jerusalem, and they're turning their swords into plowshares and all the rest of it. And Micah is saying at that point, okay, we're all in this together. You walk with your God, we'll walk with our God, but we're not going to make any attempt to convert to your God or you to our God. Let's live in. There would be no peace in Jonah's and Micah's vision if those various traditions, cultural traditions, got into dispute and opposition with each other. There's a very radical kind of ecumenism coming out of Micah 4, and if that implies anything, I think it implies, well, don't ever think you can put God in any box or monopolize God or have a monopoly of the truth. You walk with your God, we'll walk with ours. That goes a bit far for most of us. Go on, Rebecca.
So I was going to say, I might be a bit controversial in what I'm going to say, really, but my personal view is that, you know, we've almost try and make everything too nice, and I think sometimes when people come to church, who don't come to church very often, what they find is it's all nicey, and I think increasingly that we need to find a way in which we can show that it's okay to protest against suffering to God, and to cry out against suffering to God, because I think in some ways in life that's what people are looking for. And you know, the tradition of the psalmists, of so many of the psalms, in their protests and their anger against God, as I think has been very helpful to people who perhaps don't come to church very often, but during this pandemic have found a bit of a voice. And I think we need to help people to find a way in which they can kind of protest to God about the things that are going wrong and the things that they feel unhappy with, because whether we like it or not, people who often don't come to church or wouldn't say they were Christians do blame God and do say, oh, this is God's fault. And I'm not sure it's helpful for us then to be saying, no, it's not really God's fault. Honestly, it's not. I don't think God needs us to defend him.
Yeah, okay. That I think that's insightful, and it's anticipating next week when we will turn. No, that's okay. But we will turn to those psalms of lament and see some of the very and this is liturgy when we come to the psalms, and somehow the church has long since abandoned lament, and maybe in COVID-19. When people are struggling with all sorts of things, we've got to find symbols, we've got to find rituals, we've got to find liturgies that can give expression and voice to pain and suffering and protest.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
One other thing that came up in our group was picking up, you Johnston used the word wrestle and wrestling. And we didn't only talk about Jonah, we talked about Jacob wrestling with God, or the angel of God, and that I felt that was a very holistic picture of wrestling with and debating with and struggling with, as all being part of the picture, and a good counter to the current culture outside COVID of not letting people have different opinions, this sort of woke and cancel culture that we're facing at the moment too.
Yeah, it's I think one of the healthy things about the Hebrew Bible in particular, but I think it's a Jewish tradition, is that it is essentially disputatious. There are multiple voices running through the text from beginning to end, and they're constantly in dispute with each other. And that's life. But maybe sometimes our biblical tradition, our foundational texts, could be much more. Maybe they're much more real than we are sometimes, when we want to go on very narrow tram lines and not allow for dispute or contestedness, especially when it comes to things like ethical dispute.
Yeah.
They often say about Jewish people, where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. And that's the Bible. I suspect that there'll be no dispute about taking a little break for a cup of coffee at the moment.
No.
No, I think we can go with that.
Okay. Loretta, what have we? 10, 15 minutes?
Whatever you want to do, Johnston. Yeah.
Let's take about 15. It's 8:15, I think now. Let's come back about 8:30, and we've half an hour then to reflect a little bit further and have another conversation. That would be good, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that discussion earlier. Some very good points were raised and made by the contributions. In chapters 32 to 37, Job encounters a fourth well-meaning friend. This guy's a little more sophisticated, or at least he thinks he is, and he's got a differently nuanced argument. Elihu is his name, and he's presented in the text as a windbag. The text reads, bursting with wind. There's a bit of a Hebrew wordplay suggesting that he's something of a constipated fool. Well, Elihu intrudes on Job, believing that he, Elihu, is inspired. He has insight beyond what all the others have been offering. He also believes that when it comes to innocent suffering, the conversation is never over. Job's why to suffering with no reason, sitting there on his ash heap, is not the last word. And Elihu believes that Elihu can be fair, he can be impartial. Job's other three friends are not. Elihu is, and Job must listen. Now, in a sense, Elihu's voice is very contemporary, because when someone puts forward what seems to be an answer to questions about the meaning of suffering, there will usually be a hearing. And Elihu may well have a hearing, or the Elihus of this world may well have a hearing in the COVID-19 crisis. He is suggesting that suffering is meaningful against Job's protest, that his suffering is meaningless. Elihu acknowledges that we can only bear truly little meaningless loss. But Job's suffering, he's insisting, has meaning. and it is because God is testing Job to make him a better person. Elihu offers hope as a substitute for despair. In Ballantyne's words, Elihu is saying, trust in this with untroubled conviction. God's hand is in the suffering, knowingly, purposefully monitoring its path along the route that leads to redemption. But Elihu has no answer, despite his certainty. Ballantyne again, how can the innocent deaths of 7 sons and 3 daughters add up to a sum that equals God's love and mercy? Job, on his ash heap of suffering, experiences things differently. Not only does the experience of suffering shatter the moral coherence of the universe argument, Elihu's idea of God with a redemptive hand in suffering is further evidence in the case against God. Ballantyne comments, it may summon us not to hope, but to deepen despair. Elihu is a windbag, a constipated fool. Job has an argument with God, and he demands an answer from God. He's actually accused God of gross mismanagement of the universe, and declares quite frankly that there is no morally coherent universe at all. And Job has put God in the dock on trial, and God takes a long time to turn up in court. In modern law, I suppose we might say God is in contempt of court. Job waits in pained silence before God shows and at last says something. The ultimate disputant in the drama is God. And at last, in chapters 38 to 42, there are what we call the whirlwind speeches of God. Now, whirlwinds blow people away by their sheer force and power, and God confronts Job in court with massive power. The sovereign creator speaks, and while these chapters are incredibly artistic and are full of creative wonder and provide us with the most powerful creation theology in the Bible, at the same time, they bury Job in his ash heap by their sheer power. Who is Job before the immense power of God? Walter Brueggemann says, it is to be noticed that Yahweh in these lyrical utterances pays no attention to Job's defiant demands and exhibits no interest in Job's troubles. Job's protest and dispute with God is only a quibble about suffering and innocence, and what is that before the inscrutable mystery and power of God? Well, the dramatists of ancient Israel have created a whirlwind of a play. They might well be saying that the traditional covenant and wisdom traditions of the community's faith are worth nothing when confronted with an awesome creator. But even though God buries Job in the ash heap, the lived experience of suffering without reason protests against all settled and traditional beliefs. And God has not answered the question. God answered Job with a whirlwind of sheer power, but totally ducked the question of justice. There was nothing fair about Job's intense suffering. Losing one's entire economic and social capital is serious, but losing 10 children is traumatic suffering, which a Job will never get over. Job's justice demand is met by God's silence. And again, these dramatists may be facing lived experience. There are many demands for justice out of the sufferings of life, and the end of life can be reached, in fact, without any justice being realized. Life perhaps is not always fair, and at the end there may still be a divine silence. Job appears in the drama to submit to the sheer power of God, but we need to look closely at Job's final words. They read in our New Revised Standard Version translation, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now, the Hebrew translated by the New Revised Standard Version is the word maz, which can mean to reject or recant. But the Hebrew is complex, and whether Job, in response to the whirlwind speeches, is recanting is open to question. Was Job responding to the awesomeness of creation, but not to the existential question of suffering without reason? Well, there are two other possible translations of this verse. One is, now that my eyes have seen you, I shudder with sorrow for mortal clay. Or another, now my eye has seen you, and so I reject you, and I feel sorry for all humanity. Robert Burt, whom we quoted earlier, himself offers a translation. I have heard of you with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. Of all that I have said to you with my mouth, I am appalled. Therefore, in dust and ashes, I withdraw. There is uncertainty in the text. Burt goes on to say, or to ask, was Job appalled at his own presumptuousness in what he has said to God in charging God with injustice? Or was he appalled at God's injustice, which he had described as such? Was Job withdrawing his indictment? Or was he withdrawing from further relations with God? The text at this point is enigmatic, and that may be very intentional on the author's or the dramatist's part. We are challenged to wrestle with diverse possibilities as part of our experience of suffering without reason. The Job lived happily ever after end to the book is problematic. The happy ending belongs to the two opening chapters, with the chapters in between, with the dramatic dialogue standing alone as a struggle with innocent suffering and with the problem of God. What we have in the larger picture of lived experience, if you like, is Proverbs and Job together providing a model of faith. The former is submission and submissive, and the latter, Job, is disputatious, argumentative. Job is a person of faith, and his faith is not submissive or quietist, but faith as protest. Faith, in a sense, is enigmatic, as Job, in Brueggemann's words, is endlessly in a relationship with God the Creator that admits of no ready fix. This is faith beyond easy conviction. Job refuses easy explanations of suffering as a result of sin or guilt or testing. He lives without justice in the end and is still protesting and defiant, perhaps even withdrawing from God in the end. Yet he continues to protest and argue, and he will not let God off the hook. For the dramatists of the book of Job, that is faith. Brueggemann again, Job in an artistic way is endlessly contemporary, because the inability to reduce raw life to explanation is a perennial human reality. And I suspect it is a human reality as we struggle with meaning and with COVID-19. Well, we can open up, you can unmute and we can open up and have a conversation for the last little while before we bring the evening to a close. We might want to ask, is life always fair? Is justice always realized? How do we cope when we begin to realize that there are no answers? And Job, of course, does not shut up or let go. What do we make of this character? Are we all back in the loop?
Yeah. Clive here again.
Hi, Clive.
What Johnston said, this the human reality is. I mean, that is what it is. I mean, it's probably goes back to sort of Viktor Frankl with the unavoidable suffering. It's all part of the human condition, and that really to wrestle with it and to protest and to argue with God is perhaps okay. It's I suppose it's a human condition that we've got to blame somebody else for our own suffering, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. It's a human reality, and there's no one to blame. You know, it's part of living, and it's part of, you know, not only the human condition, but you know, the whole world, you know, the whole of creation, you know, is suffering in some way, and but it's okay, you know.
What people ask though,
try and blame somebody else is just
okay. Yeah. But I suppose whether one is of a faith tradition or a humanist tradition or a secular tradition or whatever, some people would be asking, well, why is it like that, and why does it have to be like that?
Well, it is what it is. There's no explanation. I don't think there's no. It's just the way things are.
Well, do you remember last week before we got to Frankl, we looked briefly at whoever wrote Ecclesiastes, who got to the end of it and said, "Look, there are questions you're never going to get answers to. Get on and live life to the best of your ability." And then maybe the depth of his wisdom, and it was similar to what Frankl was saying, go and do some good.
Yeah.
Do good, some love.
Johnston, I'm reminded of Thomas Merton's prayer. In despair, sometimes he prayed that, Lord God, sometimes I have no idea where I am going or what I am doing. But I believe that my desire to please you, God, does in fact please you. And I can't remember, but at the end of it is, you know, and that's where I put my trust in you to lead me.
Okay. That's Thomas Merton.
Thomas Merton. We won't always get the answers, and there is a mystery about suffering. So anyhow, that's only it just came into my head there.
One of the things about suffering is that it reveals what's in your heart. And I think I was in a talk by Louis Giglio. He said, suffering is like a megaphone. It amplifies what comes out of you. Sort of threw that out.
Okay, that's similar to what I think C.S. Lewis said as well.
Yeah.
In his book, The Problem of Pain, Pain is God's megaphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe Louis Giglio was quoting him. I need to listen to that talk.
Wisdom isn't a monopoly of one person. They maybe both said the words.
Johnston, could I make a comment from the area of spirituality on this? And I'm proceeding into this with the background that I have in this is that there is no answer to why there is all the problematic stuff in the universe that there is. I just can't see us solving that. But looking at it from the point of view of spirituality, now there would be several others in this group who would be part of this. We meet. It's part of the contemplative tradition in Ireland and elsewhere. Now, the whole idea of that, and this would be very real, I think, for those of us who gather for our weekly meetings, sadly not recently, is that we attend to something that is deep within us, that we may choose to name the divine, or God, or the transcendent, or the omega, or the alpha, or whatever. We all have our own words for it. But it would be where I would, over a lifetime, say that I finally come to rest spiritually. Now, I'm very grateful to that group, and I'm glad that they meet, because it has enabled me to, as it were, program with some regularity that encounter with what is deep within inside me. Now, I link this up with the biblical metaphor of being made in the image of God. Now, again, I don't really know what that means in hard scientific terms, and actually I don't care, because as a metaphor, as a poetic statement, it represents something that is very profound in me. And when I say profound, I mean it is something that I cannot manipulate, but which I sense is in charge of me. And I have come to feel that it is worthwhile trusting that, because it can take me by the hand, it can take me by the mind, it can take me by the heart, and it can lead me in my own very finite way. It can do that. Now, I have to think that if I'm facing something that's problematic, it could be in our political society, it could be an illness of my nervous system. I happen to think that that inner image, that inner voice, is in a way more concerned about this than I am. So that leads me to think that the question of evil, which we objectify, that the question of evil, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the spiritual discipline that I've just talked about, the problem of evil is a problem that God is wrestling with, God's self. And when I emerged from the hour of meditation with my friends, I leave with the sense that God is saying, Richard, you're the best I've got. You're the only one I've got right at the moment to deal with this. I am perplexed with the problem of evil. Richard, do your best with it. And Megan, you do your best with it. And Sheila, you do your best with it. And Johnson, you do your best with it. And David, you there, you do your best with it. And all of us here, go out, you do your best with it. In a sense, I think the question is to be reversed. Is it that God depends on us to deal with the questions of evil?
Okay, thank you. I think that may be similar to what I think appears very early on in the biblical narrative, that Exodus comes about by human agency. It takes a Moses to go and do the heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
That has been a big help for me.
Good. Any other reflections around that, or other questions or insights? Maybe it's where we end this evening and take the thoughts away with us, reflect on them as and when we can, and again to say to people, thank you. For many of you have shared very openly and honestly insights and thoughts, and that's what makes these sessions enriching. And we come to the third session next week, when we will try to focus on singing songs of lament through the disorientation and dislocation of life. And it was Rebecca earlier who reminded us of those psalms or songs of lament, of which there are more in the book of Psalms than there are songs of praise, which usually comes as a bit of surprise to a lot of people. But we'll look at that next week. Thank you for joining in this evening. Have a good week until we gather again. And good to see all of you. And stay safe and take care.
Johnston, could I just ask you, your previous talks, which a number of us have greatly benefited from, have been published. You're gathering this together for publication, are you, your talks? I would want to have a record of that.
The manuscript is there. It's on a final proofing stage, and it will go to publication and print very soon. We could have copies before this course ends on the 17th of November.
It'll be a nice birthday present for me.
What's that, Kathy?
That'll be a nice birthday present for me.
Birthday on the 17th.
Yes.
Okay. I'll sign a copy for you.
Oh, brilliant.
Okay, folks.
Good night. God bless. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye. Loretta. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
There we are. Down one bow.